here at LeMans Edition, we've got several options to choose from when it comes to converting your C8 Corvette to center exhaust. So let's talk about our track system. All LeMans Edition center exhaust systems are catback systems. This means you can leave your factory catalytic converters in place. Today we're going over the track system. This includes our track uppers, our track elbows, our true X pipe design, your choice of tips, and all mounting hardware. When you order the LeMans Edition center exhaust system, you'll have 3 different styles of tip racks to choose from. First is polished. Second is a black tip rack. Fully released, polished with blackout tip rack. So when you choose the LeMans Edition NPP system, which is much more entailed, it will come with everything you see here. The most important part is the modular NPP elbow. This is what facilitates the NPP option. You'll notice that there is a plate here. This is where you mount your factory NPP motors. This is what we call our NPP candy cane. This is what allows you to reroute the exhaust gases by putting your car in touring mode and sending it through the secondary mufflers, which gives you the ability to quiet it down at your discretion. You'll notice that all our connections are made with the highest quality stainless steel V-bands. All LeMans Edition center exhaust systems come standard with 2 simulator chips. However, if you have an NPP car but are not going to run an NPP system, you will need to order 2 more simulator chips for a total of 4. This will keep your check engine light from coming on. Let's go over the LeMans Edition center exhaust conversion body panels. So all of our LeMans Edition center exhaust conversions come with what we call our center bezel and side inserts. Now that we've gone over everything your kit will include, let's go ahead and get started on the installation process of this 2022 C8 Corvette. Okay, so the first step of the installation process is going to be to remove the liner of the trunk. You're going to want to do this before you raise the car in the air. Start by removing the 4 net clips. Next, you're going to want to remove the carpet inner liner. Next, we're going to remove the engine access panel. You're going to want to use a T15 Torx. Once you've removed all of the T15 Torx, you're going to go ahead and remove the access plate. Now you have access to the factory bolts on the exhaust. Since we're here, we're going to go ahead and remove all the T15s that hold the top of the bumper on. So next, before we lift the car, you always want to use lifting pucks. Before you send her all the way up, always go back and make sure the arms are on the pucks where they're supposed to be. Okay, let's go ahead and get her up in the air. So we're going to go ahead and remove the rear wheels. This is going to give you access to the lower exhaust manifold bolts. And remove the inner wheel liners. This is going to give you access to the exhaust system from the bottom. So before you remove this little plastic panel here, there's a 7mm bolt you're gonna have to take out. You simply grab the piece and pop it off. It'll give you a little bit of resistance, but it's just clips. So now that exposes your final T15 screws. Now before you can take out the liner, you'll notice that there are a couple of Christmas tree plastic poppers you're gonna have to pop out. There's one there, and there's one right there. And go ahead and pop out the Christmas tree. There's one more up top. Before you can actually take the liner out, there are a few 7mm bolts you gotta find. It's gonna start right here. We got 3 that hold the liner in right here so that this can now come loose. You also on this side have 2 that go through the bottom sill and into the liner. Before you go to remove the liner, just double check that you've gotten all of the 7mm bolts and the Christmas trees out. Okay, although the fender liner is made of one piece, it does have a slit at the top that allows you to bring it out easily. You're gonna wanna be careful, you don't wanna tear it, but just go ahead and start popping it out like this. And you're gonna do the same thing on this side. Bring it down under the lip, it can be a little tricky. There you go. Factory diffuser, this is just a handful of 7mm bolts. So over here, you're going to see that there's 2 T15s here and the same on the other side. Those are the last 2 bolts you're going to want to remove before you can take out the actual diffuser itself. Okay, now go ahead and remove the lower diffuser. Next, there's a pretty difficult bolt to get to if you're not familiar with the rear bumper on these cars. It's a 10mm. You're definitely going to want to use an electric ratchet and a deep well 10. Okay, so it's a little hard to get to. It's the bolt that holds the rear quarter panel to the rear bumper. You're going to have to look all the way up in here, and you see that stud with a 10mm bolt on it. Okay, now before you remove the bumper, I highly recommend that you use some blue painter's tape just to protect the rear quarters. Okay, so now let's remove the rear bumper. It's a little tricky. You're going to want to go slow and take it easy, and make sure you don't forget about the wiring harness because you're going to have to unplug those plugs. Okay, so now that we removed the rear bumper off of the car, we're going to go ahead and start the process of prepping it for the new plastics. This is going to include removing this factory grille here, also removing the rivets that hold on your factory heat shield. There's 4 of those. And then finally, we're going to make the cut right after the second bung of the grill mount. So these are 7mm. There's a handful of them, and just go ahead and take them all out. Nice straight cut after the second bung of the grill mount. So you have one here on the outside, and then the second one going towards the inside. You're just going to basically cut real close to the mount. Like, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect because you're never going to see it. Okay, there you go. Simple as that. You're just going to remove that center part, and you can see where we cut right after the second bung on both sides. Next, you're going to have to remove the factory heat shields. They're held in by 4 rivets. Just make sure that as you remove the rivets, you're going to want to clean up a little bit, pick up any pieces of metal that may have came off, just in case. You don't want to move the bumper around and end up scratching your customer's bumper. Okay, so next for the rear bumper, what we're going to do is drill out the holes that the rivets were in, just to open them up a little bit so that the nut plates and the screws that go with them will fit. So you're just going to drill it out right here and come in and drill this second one out. So all 4 of them on both sides, just drill them out so that the screw will fit through the hole. Once you've done that, you're going to take the nut plate, which is this, and you're going to put it on the outside and run the screws through the rear balance that you just made. Now you'll do the same with the short one. You put the short nut plate on the outside with the screws and washers facing inside. This is what will hold your side inserts in place. So you're going to put those pretty snug. So these are the side inserts. You'll notice that there's slotted tabs. That's what's going to go on the screws underneath the washers. Okay, so if you look from the back, you're going to see these slide in place just like that underneath the washers. Once you've installed the nut plates, you can go ahead and install the side insert. You're going to want to put some pressure on the outside in order to make sure that the side insert is flush, and then just tighten. Okay, so it's time to mount the bezel. You'll notice on the back there's 2 studs, and on the top there's 2 slots. This is going to go on the bumper like this. So the first thing you're going to want to do, of course, is remove the nuts and washer from the studs. A little bit of blue tape down. This is so that you can mark where you're going to have to put your holes. Here, a little bit here. So you're going to take your Sharpie and lay the bezel in place. Make sure that it's all the way against the top and that the side pieces are nice and even. And you take your Sharpie and just mark where the stud is. Okay. Now go ahead and remove the bezel. And you can see this is approximately where you're going to want to put your hole. Okay, now that you've marked the location of the studs, you're going to go ahead and just drill a hole. Start with a small hole as a preliminary hole to make sure you go. So you've drilled 4 holes, 1 on each side, and 1 here for the slots. Now you can go ahead and put your nut plates in place. You've done your preliminary test fit. You're going to go ahead and pull the bezel back off and open these holes up just a little bit more, because these aren't really for alignment. These top ones are for alignment. The side ones are just there to fix the bezel in place. You don't want to rely on those side holes for an alignment. Okay, so might as well go ahead and take care of the NPP motor plugs while it's up in the air and they're easy to get to. You're going to need a pick. This is your factory NPP motor. What you're going to want to do is go ahead and pop this little red safety piece back like that, and the plug should come right off. Next, you're going to install your chip. You'll notice that the simulator chip has 3 prongs and the plug has 5. That's okay. The center 3 are the only ones we're going to need to use. This is the receiver that's going to go on the same side as the red safety clip. You're going to push that all the way in until it clicks. So you should be able to pop that safety clip right back in place and have a good fit. If you try to put this in upside down, it's a tight fit, so it'll feel like it's in there. But if you don't hear the click, you know that it's not in there, and you're going to end up with a check engine light. We've reached one of the more difficult bolts to get to. This is going to be the lower bolt on the triangle flange of the passenger side of the car. If you come up here, you'll see this is the bolt right here. It is a 13. It's pretty difficult to get to. You've got to weave your arm in and out of the suspension here, but you get yourself a deep well 13mm socket and go ahead and break that one loose. Now that you have removed the lower flange nut, we're going to move to this mount. You're going to need a 13mm flat wrench. There's 2 nuts. There's one here, and then there's one way up in right here where you can barely see it. They're kind of a pain to get to, so I like to do them first. Next move, once you have removed that nut from the exhaust flange, is you're going to take these little, what we call the potato mounts, and you're going to go ahead and pull that off of there and let it just hang down on the muffler. Do the same thing on the other side. Now that we've removed the, what we call the rubber potato mounts that hold the actual muffler in place, we're going to go ahead and finish taking off the bolts that hold the exhaust system to the catalytic converter. If you look down in here, you'll notice that on the passenger side of the car, what we call the 3-bolt flange has 2 more bolts here at the top that you'll have to remove. These are 13mm bolts. And then over here on this side, the driver's side of the car, there's going to be 2 15mm bolts. Now, something that you're going to want to do is leave one of the bolts in place on both sides so that a little later when we lower the exhaust system, it can't just fall out. That way you'll be able to reach the AFM motors to unplug them before removing the muffler. Okay, pro tip, when you're removing these nuts, be very careful not to drop them down into the transmission mount assembly. So if you look here on the side, we've left 1 bolt on the passenger side, almost completely undone, but still with a full nut's worth of thread. And we did the same thing here on the driver's side. Again, this is so that when we lower the muffler, we will be able to access the AFM valve plugs, because you can't remove the muffler without unplugging the AFM valves, but you also can't get to the AFM valves without lowering the muffler. Okay, now that you've removed the upper bolts from the exhaust to the catalytic converter, you're going to lower the car back down, and you're going to want to remove these muffler hangers. I suggest, especially if you're doing it by yourself, to go ahead and put something under here that you can lean the muffler down on. That way you'll be able to access the AFM valves in order to unplug that. Okay, so we have put a tray under here to receive the muffler as we lower it. We're going to go ahead and undo the final aluminum mount here and lower it down on the tray. Now remember, we still have one bolt on each side at the upper flanges so that the muffler can't just slide out. We're going to have to access the AFM valves in order to unplug them. So I'm going to lower this and let it sit on this tray, and then I'll be able to reach in there and unplug the AFM valve. After that, I'll undo the last two bolts, and we should be able to just pull it out nice and smooth. Okay, so this gives you a gap, and now we'll be able to reach in here and unplug these AFM valves, which are right here. The one on the passenger side is pretty easy because you can access the plug, but the one on the driver's side is a little tougher. The plug is on the upper side here, so it takes a little finagling. There we go. Factory exhaust system is out of the car. We can send her back up in the air. Okay, the next step that you're going to want to do now that you've removed the actual muffler itself is going to be to remove the hanger pins that the potato mounts were hanging on. They're located here on the frame rail. It is two 13mm bolts. They're easy to access now that the muffler is out of the way. There you go. So these are going to go where the factory hangers were originally. Right here, you're going to just reuse the factory hanger bolts. And this one right here is going to go where we just removed the inner hanger. Install the new LeMans Edition exhaust mounts. You're going to reuse the two factory bolts that originally held this aluminum bracket in place right here. You mount the rubber mount so that the thick part is facing towards the center of the car. So that's going to be this here. Now when we mount the other side, we're going to leave this off so that when we put the exhaust in place, we can hang it here. So the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and install the AFM chips. Now remember, you want to keep the bracket side of the chip on the opposite side of the red clip. It's right here. It should go in very snug. It's a very, very tight fit. And then it clips, and you should be able to put the lock back in place. I'm going to do the same thing here. Flat side facing the red clip, and it clips. Now I recommend that you go ahead and zip tie these up here to the harness. You don't want them flopping around. Now that we've installed the passenger side exhaust mount, you'll notice that I left off aluminum bushing piece. As I said before, when you go to put the exhaust on, you're going to want to be able to put it in this side, and then this side will have to slip on it, because otherwise it wouldn't fit in between the two bumps. Go ahead and mount our uppers. Now, an important thing to remember is on the driver's side, this is a ball and socket with a 2-hole flange. You're going to want to leave that pretty loose so that you can clock it correctly at the end. That's literally the last 2 bolts you tighten. Okay, so it is time to put our passenger side upper in place. You'll notice that the flange is a 3-hole triangle flange in the top. The 2 bolts are up at the top, and the single bolt faces the bottom. It's just going to slide right in here and go on the bolts. This one you can tighten all the way down. We're going to go ahead and do that. These exhaust flange studs can be a little bit temperamental. Highly recommend that you shoot a little bit of WD-40 in the nut itself before you go to thread them on, and also get them pretty much snugged with a hand ratchet before you hit it with an impact. The factory studs are very quick to strip out. 2 nuts on the driver's side are going to be 15. And again, make sure you shoot a little bit of WD-40 in there before you install them. And remember not to tighten them down. You want to leave them loose so that this side can swivel on the ball joint. It will be the last 2 bolts that you tighten all the way down at the end of the install. Okay, so like I said, you want to put just a little drop of WD-40 in each bolt. That way you make sure you don't damage the studs. Okay, so now it's time to go ahead and install the new polished blackout tips onto the X-pipe. Now this can be a little tricky. The tools you're going to need are going to be a 13mm flat wrench, a 6mm Allen wrench, and I recommend using a pick with the right angle on it. Make it a lot easier to install that lower bolt and washer. So the first thing you're going to do is go ahead and slide the tips into place. They should line up perfectly with these slots. I like to take them all the way to the back. Generally, that's how most customers like them. We did provide slots so that they're able to move about 10 to 15 millimeters. Some customers like the tips to stick out more. Some customers like the tips to be as far in as they'll go. And it also allows you to change the angle a little bit as well. And then you go ahead and install the bolt. What I like to do is to line up this bottom flange where it says LeMans Edition with the tip rack to where it just sticks out by maybe 2 millimeters. I generally just snug them at first. You can go back and tighten them on the car. They're actually not as hard to get to. Go back, check and make sure that you're even, which I am. Okay, so you want to make sure that the top is even. Okay, so now that we've got the top even, we're going to check the bottom. Just make sure that this flange is even with the mounting flange of the tips. It's not a big deal if you decide you want to change the angle a little bit. Once it's on the car, it's actually pretty easy to get to. Okay, now that we've got the uppers installed and we've installed one side, either side of the mount, and left the other mount off, it's going to make the install much easier. So your next step is going to be to install the track elbows. You're going to want the pin facing down. So again, you really don't want to tighten these. You just want to snug them so that everything is still easy to move around. Basically just enough so that the elbows don't fall out. Put your clamps with the bolt, the long side facing down and facing the back so that you'll be able to the socket on the bolt once it's in the car. Okay, if you're going to be installing the NPP system on the car, there's a couple of things you're going to want to check before you actually assemble it. Number one, you want to make sure that this spider moves freely inside the mount there. Factory NPP motor, you'll see that there's a little bracket with a prong on each side. And in the NPP assembly, there's a receiver on each side. So when you install this, it's going to slide down. Make sure that the bracket is in the receiver. So you don't crank on these because the housing is made out of plastic and you don't want to crack it. So just go real slow. Now finally, once the motor's in place, you're going to want to go back and check this again. We have installed our NPP motor. We've checked for clearance. We've made sure that it comes back the way it's supposed to. Next, you're going to go ahead and hang your V-bands in place. You're going to want to have the bolt facing towards the center of the car so that you don't have any interference with this mount. Remember, this one is still very loose so that you can clock it at the end. Those top bolts are the last bolts that you tighten. If you tighten them ahead of time, you're going to end up really struggling to get the tips even. Next, you're going to put a little dab of WD-40 in the mount there so that it slides in and out easily. You're going to go ahead and slide the pin into the first mount. This is going to allow you to put it up much easier. You've put the pin in on this side, which is locked in place. You've put your two V-bands on, which you just snugged good enough to where it can hold it up without you having to worry about it. The next step is going to be to hang the aluminum bracket. Now that you've snugged your V-band clamps here, you've got your pin in this side. It's holding up by itself, but everything is still nice and loose so you can move it around. You're going to go ahead and hang the next aluminum bracket with the large part of the rubber facing in. So it's important to remember that until the installation is completely done, you really want to make sure that all the connectors are pretty loose, tight enough to where everything stays in place, but loose enough where you can turn the tips, and especially this, your driver's side upper needs to be loose up at the top because you're going to need to clock it at the end when it's time to make sure that the tips are exactly the same distance, because as you clock this, it's going to move this tip in and out. Next thing you're going to want to do is hang the NPP candy canes. Now, for this installation process, this car is actually getting a track system, and we're just using it in order to do the installation guide for the NPP. When you're installing an NPP system, there will be a bracket here with a pin. It's going to come already in place. We don't have it for this car because it's not going to be an NPP car, but the bracket will already be in place and be sandwiched between this 1/4 inch aluminum plate and the factory mount. The potato shaped rubber mount is going to hang on, which will hold the candy cane up. This is going to be our NPP candy cane. The first thing you're going to do is take your V-band clamps, hang them in place. The potato mount with the large side up on the pin that will be hanging out of your NPP bracket here, followed by the installation of the candy cane. Your potato mount will be like so. We'll go ahead and do the other side. Okay, so once you've got the entire NPP system in place, you're going to want to go ahead and tighten a few of these V-bands. Just snug them down a little bit. You want to leave the tips quite loose until you get the rear bumper back on so that you can make the final adjustment. So that's just these two V-bands that go from the X pipe to the corners here. Just keep them loose enough that you can you can move them real easily. And finally, the last thing you'll want to do, you'll have two 3-foot harnesses included in the kit. You'll want to go ahead and plug them into your NPP harness from the car to the back of the motors. Again, being sure that the clips are in the right direction so you don't get a check engine light. We have left all of the connectors on the exhaust loose so that we're able to move things around the way we want. You notice that the X pipe is still able to move the way we want. Now it's time to put the rear bumper back on. Okay, so we've got the bumper back on. We're going to go ahead and start putting all those little T5 screws back in and get the bumper in place, and then we'll go back and adjust the exhaust to exactly where we want and finally mount the center bezel. So it's important that you go back and just slide them back where they used to be. We got the 10mm screw that's always kind of hard to get to done, and the two 7mm hold the rear quarter and the bumper together. We're going to go ahead and go back and tighten all the T15s across the top ledge. Earlier we marked where the bezel went and made a preliminary hole, but now we want to go back and really open it up to about a 1/2 inch hole. The reason for that is because you want enough clearance here so that the bezel is lined up by the centers, and this lets the studs fall where they may. We're going to use these slots. We're going to go ahead and slide it in, and it looks like we've got perfect clearance all the way around the tips. So that means we can go ahead and tighten up the tips. Again, if you're using an electric ratchet on the V-bands, make sure you go slow. Okay, now we're going to test our fitment one more time. Go. Looks like we still have our clearance. We get about 1/4 of an inch at the bottom and 1/4 inch at the top. And there you go. And now that you've tested the fitment of the sides, I had to sand just a little bit here on the side of this piece here to get a nice tight fit. You're going to go ahead and use a long 1/4 inch extension with a 10mm socket. These side studs are still just loose. Again, these are just for the mounting purposes. The bolts that you want to use to make sure everything's straight are these top ones, which I've already snugged. You want to make sure that the ledge on both sides is nice and even. Once you know that's even, tighten up those top 10mm bolts. And now you're going to measure the top of the tip to make sure that they're even. This is the reason that we didn't tighten the driver's side upper, because we want to make sure that we can pivot it, because as we pivot it, this tip will move in and out a few mils. So what I've done is I've pivoted it until this tip matches this tip. So now we're okay to go ahead and tighten those top bolts. When you're tightening the studs, that go on the end of the bezel here, you're going to want to use a 10mm socket and a hand wrench. Do not use an electric wrench. These are made to be snugged, not tightened. Now, our tips have been locked in place. Our bezel has been locked in place, and we can go ahead and tighten up all the V-bands left on the exhaust and make sure that everything is buttoned up correctly. This top two I'll do at the end from inside the trunk. Factory grill. Remember, it's better to cut it a little long than too short. You can't add material. So before you go ahead and cut this, I recommend that you cut it here first and here, so that you can slide this piece inside and double check your line before you make that final cut. So we're going to cut right here for tip clearance. That way we can stick each piece in there and double check our line. I cut this right here. That should be long enough to test fit it. As you can see, my first line wasn't exactly where it needed to be. So this is a good opportunity to explain why it's important to measure twice, cut once. So now we know that the bezel is here. Make sure our holes are lined up perfectly. Okay, so our new cut line is going to be just under that, because you want to make sure that it ends up underneath the bezel, not just on the side of it. About a 1/2 inch inside that line. That's going to end up right there. Okay, so you can see that you can't see the edge anymore, so that's good. That's where we wanted it. It's going to be hidden behind the bezel here. So we know we're good. We can go ahead and peel the tape, and let's do the other side. So one thing that's very important is you want to make sure that the screw holes are lined up before you make your line. Follow the bezel at a 1/2 inch. That way the edge of the grill gets hidden behind the bezel. And there you have it. So we can go ahead and peel the tape off. Final fitment. Goes right here, and there you go. Perfect. You want to make sure that you use the correct screws when you put the grills back on. They're going to be the 7mm heads, but they're actually shorter than the other ones. So you just want to find the correct ones. Now that we have set the exhaust in place, we've put the grills in place, we've made sure that the bezel is nice and even, the side inserts are nice and even, the exhaust is exactly where we want, we've tightened all the V-band clamps. The last thing that's left to do is to tighten the two 15mm bolts on the driver's side upper. Right about that 15. Okay, so these are two 15mm bolts. They're a little bit of a pain to get to, but these are the final bolts that you tighten up. You want to do this before you put any of the other plastics together, because we actually want to fire it up and test for any exhaust leaks. We showed you where the bolts were, so now you just want to come in from underneath with a long extension, kind of wrench them down. Do a few on each side until you get it nice and snug. Before you put on the factory diffuser and put the wheel wells back in, you're definitely going to want to fire the car up and test for any exhaust leaks around your V-bands. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. Tony, if you want, go ahead and fire it up. Okay, so everything's good except this one, so we're going to loosen it up a little bit and just retighten it. Now that we've tested for leaks and we know that everything is correct, we can go ahead and start putting the rest of it back together. We'll put in our factory diffuser, our wheel wells, and finally our rear wheels. Okay, so we got the wheel wells back in. Of course, it's important to double and triple check that there aren't anything missing. you've got a few Christmas trees that go in a lot of these T15s. Final one here is going to be to pop this back in place. There's just clips, so it's pretty easy. You just put the clips in place and give it a little. The wheel wells are back in. You can go ahead and replace the factory diffuser. It's a little tricky. You want to slide it in, up, so that it gets inside the valence. And then the bottom of it goes under these little clips. And there you go. The wheels are back on the car. I want to go and crank these things on with an impact. They're pretty susceptible to having problems if you do that.